So we've established in the last episode, quite comprehensively, I think, the Bible's rejection of slave breeding. And I left the listener with a clip where Dan McClellan claimed that Exodus 21 endorsed the practice of slave breeding. So let's read from Exodus 21 right now. Verses 2 through 4 say, "When you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th year he shall go out free for nothing. If he comes in single, he shall go out single. If he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out alone." Here's the clip of Dr. McClellan's claim.
How did the United States of America get slaves after they outlawed the international slave trade? They bred them. And that's exactly what Exodus 21 describes. Hey, if you go into debt slavery and then your master gives you a wife, he keeps the kids. So you can not ever trade or kidnap or anything, and you can still get permanent slaves by just breeding your debt slaves.
So before I offer an interpretation that is more faithful to the full scope of Scripture, let me just take an ad hominem approach and assume that Dr. Dan McClellan's interpretation is correct, that this text actually is talking about masters taking the children of slaves in order to be their own slaves, because I think that that interpretation ends up causing more exegetical problems than it solves. Hebrew slaves were allowed to leave after 7 years of service. So keeping these children as if they were slaves would be in contradiction of that entire premise. Even if the slave had these children, say at year 4 of his contracted service, upon leaving the 7th year, that would mean the children would be allowed to leave 3 years later when they were at the age of 7 or something like that. You know, what kind of work merit does the master receive by having a child slave at those early staged years? And that's the best case scenario for Dan's interpretation. Now, Dan may claim that the 7th year release only applied to slaves who were purchased. And since children born into houses of slavery were not purchased, they didn't have to be released on the 7th year. But this also contradicts the Bible verses about why Hebrews had this law in the first place, that Hebrews were not to be in any kind of slave contract for more than 7 years, since in Deuteronomy 15 it says, "You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. Therefore, I command you this today." And then God said in this context of commanding the 7th year releases. So imposing lifelong contracts on children upon their birth is in direct violation of that very principle, since it would be going back to the standards of slavery in Egypt, which God was against doing. God brought them out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery, where lifelong oppressive contracts were forced on them. That's contrary to what Exodus is trying to get at. So then you also have the law in Leviticus 25, verses 40 and 41, which say, "He shall be with you as a hired servant and as a sojourner. He shall serve with you until the year of Jubilee. Then he shall go out from you, he and his children with him, and go back to his own family and return to the possession of his fathers." So there, in Leviticus, a Hebrew slave is not only allowed to leave upon his entitled year of release, but he's also entitled to take his children with him back to the land of his tribe and clan. And this verse gives absolutely no restrictions on if the children he took with him were children born to him while he was free or while he was a slave. Only that he's entitled to take them with him out of slavery once he's freed from his contract on the year of Jubilee or the 7th year. And furthermore, in none of these Bible verses, including in Exodus 21, does the Bible ever refer to any of these children as being slaves. Now, Dan McClellan's belief that these children were slaves is him imposing onto the text something that isn't there at all. But I don't want to only pick on biblical critics for their inconsistent interpretations of Exodus 21, because leaders in the church have also forced onto the text things that are not there, as an attempt to manipulate the verses in such a way to avoid the plain meaning of the text. Here's Mike Winger trying to add a made-up context to try to rationalize what's going on here.
Now, when the man comes to the end of his contract, if he has a wife and kids who he didn't bring in, but rather they are also contracted servants of this same guy. So his wife's a contracted servant, so is he. But I started my 6 years. Maybe I re-upped, and now I got another 6 years. But she re-upped. Sorry, my hypothetical scenario is falling apart on me. She re-upped, and then he didn't. So he's going free, and she has another, say, 4 years left on her time. He can't just be like, come on, you're my wife, let's go. No, she's contractually obligated to stay. So he has a couple options. He can wait. He can wait. Number 2, he can buy out their debt, pay for that, pay the rest of the contract off, and then take them. Or 3, he can make a lifetime contract saying, I love my master, da-da-da-da-da.
So Mike Winger says that this is only describing something like when a male slave in the 6th year of his service receives a woman as a wife who is just starting off her 1st year on her contract. And they both have kids together in that year. By the time the male slave's 7th year rolls up, he's allowed to leave. But the woman still has 6 more years left to serve out her contract on, so she has to stay. Mike Winger is trying to appeal here to a contract term length differential between the man and the woman as to why one of them leaves but the other one stays, ostensibly assuming that eventually the woman and the kids would be allowed to leave in order to reconcile back with the male slave who was released into his freedom. I think this is a gross twisting of the meaning of this text, accomplished by making up a context that is not in the text, whilst also ignoring what is in the text. Because in verse 7 of Exodus 21, it says that female slaves are not to go out in the same manner as the male slaves do. Because this is a series that I'm making on this channel on slavery, I would be a little bit remiss in not addressing the concept of a concubine, because in the Bible, a concubine was a type of female slave. So I'm going to address that a little bit right now. In this passage, when it's talking about female slaves, it's referring to concubines specifically, not just female physical laborers, which are spoken about in other parts of Scripture, but in this part, in Exodus 21, a concubine was a woman who was not to go out to freedom on the 7th year, but was kept indefinitely by the man. I'm not going to go into all the aspects of what the concubine was in this particular series, because I've already made a series about that topic titled Concubines, Wives, and Biblical Law on this channel, which I would encourage you to listen to if you haven't. But in that series, I prove and I argue for and prove that concubines were women who had free will and agency, even when they were serving out their concubinal contracts to a man, and that this concubinal contract is equivalent to what we have in the modern day when a man signs a prenuptial agreement with a woman. In that series, I say that prenuptial agreements are not real marriages, because marriages are commitments for life, whereas prenuptials are terms of separation built right into the relationship. And since I think it's contradictory to have one foot fully planted in a life commitment while also having the other foot planted in a plan on how to separate, I think it's also contradictory then, therefore, to refer to prenuptials as if they are marriages. So that at best, I think, one could only call a prenuptial arrangement with a woman to be a live-in girlfriend, not a covenant wife. That doesn't mean prenuptials are wrong. In fact, I think they are right, because the Bible has provisions for how to run this kind of relationship. And again, the details about how that works is in my other series. But for now, just know that it isn't a sin to exercise a prenup, in the same way that it isn't a sin to dissolve a concubinal contract and send a concubine away, because it's not a marriage covenant being broken Rather, it's more akin to breaking up with a girlfriend. Concubines did provide sexual companionship under this kind of contract in a similar way that prenuptials do. But this companionship was never physically forced onto the woman because she had the right to leave such relationships as well, under no legal penalty, even if she was doing it for immoral reasons. And I don't expect a hostile skeptic to believe that just on the basis of what I presented right now, because I'm focused on another aspect. But I argue from the text for all of these contentions concerning concubinage in my other series, where any skeptic listeners can direct their objections. But for now, going back to Mike Winger and what he's saying, he says that a woman just had to be waiting to be released. And as I already said, verse 7 proves that since she was given to this slave as a sexual companion, she was a concubine. And concubines did not leave their masters like the male slaves did every 7 years. Furthermore, Leviticus 25 already established that when the male slave does go free, he takes his children with him. But in Exodus 21, we see something else happening, because the children do not go with the father to his freedom. Rather, they are staying with the mother and the master. So, if both Dan McClellan and Mike Winger, their interpretations fail to stand up to all of these verses, what interpretation are we left with to explain what is going on here? I hope the listener will allow me to offer an interpretation that does not contradict any of the texts I've already mentioned, and one that shows also the goodness of God's regulations. The passage in Exodus 21 never refers to these children as slaves, not once. And since I've already established in the last episode that children born in houses of slavery do not de facto become slaves to any master, then these children must belong to their master in some different sense. They must belong to him as his own children and heirs to his estate. What's happening in these passages is that if the slave decides to leave, the master takes on the concubine and her children to raise them as his own family because of whatever fallout that might have occurred between the female slave and the male slave. Let's consider the scenarios that Exodus 21 presents. Scenario 1, the wife and her children shall be her masters, and he shall go out alone. Scenario 2, but if the slave plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I shall not go out free. The Bible juxtaposes these two scenarios. So notice in scenario 2 where the slave says, I love my wife and my children. What would that imply about scenario 1 if those two scenarios are juxtaposed against each other? It would imply that in scenario 1, he doesn't actually love the woman or his children, and he goes out free, effectively releasing her from her concubinal contract to him. Now, it was not a sin to do this because the law provides for concubinal contracts to end. So he's simply breaking up with his girlfriend in this case, and it may very well be for good reason because the woman herself may have proven to him that she was not a trustworthy woman to be had in a marriage covenant, and the slave just needed some time to figure that out. And in that scenario, the safety net to the woman and her children is provided by the very master who arranged that relationship in the first place. His taking on the woman and her children gives the man, the master that is, gives the master heirs for his own name and estate, meaning that he has effectively taken these children on as his own. But notice in Exodus 21, verse 10 through 11, it says, he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, or her marital rights. And if he does not do these 3 things for her, she shall go out for nothing, without payment of money. Here, Exodus 21 says that the concubine is legally entitled to also be the decision maker in ending her concubinal contract if she sees that the man she is designated to is failing to live up to his side of the contract and not providing for her. Applying this understanding to the male slave leaving could also very well be the woman deciding that she does not want to enter into marriage with this man because of what she has seen in the time span from his ability to be a trustworthy husband and provider. And from this, the same results serve all parties involved. The man goes out free, and the woman and her children are in the safety net of the master's provisions, while the master attains children of his own to continue his name and estate in Israel. All parties are served in any of these outcomes. Now, before we explore scenario 2, where the slave does end up marrying the concubine and entering into a lifelong commitment, let's first ask the question, is it possible at all for the man to be released from the oversight of the master while also taking his wife and children with him? Is that scenario possible at all, where he can leave and take the wife and children with him out of slavery into their own freedom? I personally do think that this is possible, but I just don't think it's likely because of it not being very beneficial to any of the parties involved. And here's why. This male slave is serving a slave sentence because he got into some kind of trouble financially or otherwise. Meaning he's already proven himself to be bad with money and provisions. That's why he's in slavery to begin with. The fact that God allowed for Hebrews to be forgiven of their debts every 7 years and become free again was a standard that allowed men to restart anew and make themselves better the next time. But this didn't always happen. It's very possible for a man to be continually lazy and loose with his money, such that it would put his family that he is to provide for at major risk. So the fact that the male slave was released at the 7th year didn't mean he was all of a sudden trustworthy and credible again. No. He's just starting back at ground zero, which is still a position of poverty. And that's not exactly a safe spot to be for a woman and children who would be reliant upon him for their livelihoods. Now, this is not a risk that I'm just making up. This is a real risk that the Bible itself talks about. Consider these verses from Proverbs. Proverbs 19, verse 10 says, "It is not fitting for a fool to live in luxury, much less for a slave to rule over princes." Proverbs is saying here that it's unfitting for a slave to be in power over princes because there is a reason why a slave is in the position he is in to begin with. He's there for exercising poor judgment, if any judgment at all. And to put such a person in authority over others would be as unfitting as if a fool were to live in luxury. Here's another one, Proverbs 30, verses 21 through 23. "Under 3 things the earth trembles, under 4 it cannot bear up: a slave when he becomes a king, and a fool when he is filled with food." In this list of the earth trembling, Proverbs includes the scenario where a slave is placed in the position of highest political authority. A slave would be the least capable and least wise, given the most responsibility and most authority. The risk and danger of this happening is something Proverbs says is enough to make the earth tremble. So, how much more then should a wife tremble at the idea of being under the authority of such a man? Even if he is free by technicality, there's no guarantee that he has learned his lesson. And the decision has to be made by those involved, including by the master. And that's what this law in Exodus 21 does. It gives prima facie authority to the master, who by virtue of him being a free man and owner of his own estate, to exercise judgment in this scenario and take the woman and her children as a protective measure from being under the headship of a man who the master deems as someone who would be a risk to be under the headship of. Notice in Leviticus 25, when the man leaves out of slavery and he takes his children with him, it states in that chapter that he's not in a state of net zero assets upon being granted his freedom, because he already has land and assets to go to once he returns to his freedom. It says in Leviticus 25, verse 40 and 41, "He shall serve with you until the year of Jubilee. Then he shall go out from you, he and his children with him, and go back to his own family and return to the possession of his fathers." See, here the released slave already has a land to return to, in possession of, and thus an estate and means of provisions to raise his children and family off of. Is this the case of the released slave in the example of Exodus 21? Let's say the released slave did not have an estate to go to. What other provisions might he have to be able to provide as a father and head of his house? Well, the parallel passage to Exodus 21 is found in Deuteronomy 15, where it states the same law of release, only in this passage it's talking of granting the released slaves a share in the fruits of their labors as parting gifts. Deuteronomy 15 verses 13 and 14 say, "And when you let him go free from you, you shall not let him go empty-handed. You shall furnish him liberally out of your flock, out of your threshing floor, and out of your winepress. As the Lord your God has blessed you, you shall give to him." And then in verse 18 it says, "It shall not seem hard to you when you let him go free from you, for at half the cost of a hired servant he has served you 6 years. So the Lord your God will bless you in all that you do." So here we see that the law speaks of a master giving all kinds of provision to the released slave to have upon his departure. Now, do these count at all as a basis from which the released slave can be a provider? Yeah, it very well may be. But notice that the verses I just read to you are speaking to a situation where the slave was actually providing these fruits to the master in his hard labor. It says, "For at half the cost of a hired servant, he has served you 6 years." So that it would be good and right to give these parting gifts if the slave was working hard and being faithful in his contract. But if the slave was being lazy, malingering his time until his release, would the master still be obliged to give these parting gifts? I would say no, since they were not part of the fruits of what the slave's labor contributed. Because a lazy slave does not do any labor that produces fruit. And after all, the Bible says in Deuteronomy 24 that you shall give him his hire on the day he earns it, which means he has to earn it. I like the way the New Testament writers put this when they say, "If anyone will not work, let him not eat." That's in 2 Thessalonians 3. And Proverbs, yet again, reminds us, "An idle person will suffer hunger." That's in Proverbs 19. Imagine being the master in this scenario when you are about to release a slave, a lazy slave, because the 7th year has arrived. He certainly is entitled by law to have his release, but how could you in good conscience give him all kinds of provisions after he has malingered for those 7 years? What's worse, send off the woman and her children to be with him on their own? This law in Exodus 21 is a protection from such an earth-trembling scenario. The master has prima facie authority to intervene on behalf of the woman and her children while the male slave goes out alone, based on whatever the case may be that the master assesses serves the best interests of all parties. But what about the scenario where the slave is proven to be trustworthy and he does receive gifts upon his departure from the master? Would the law allow for the man to take his wife and kids with him if he wanted to leave the master? As I already said, the master has prima facie ownership over the wife and children. And if they truly do belong to the master, if the children really are the children of the master by adoption, then that means the children are his to give away as well. If the master's assessment of the slave was one of built trust and credibility, and it just so happens the slave wants to leave with his woman and with his children with him, it is the judgment call of the master to make, if that will be allowed, based on the master's wise assessment of the slave's work performance during his time as a slave to the master. And this practice of granting children over in adoption for the purpose of inheritance and estate provisioning is seen being practiced in the Bible. For example, in Genesis chapter 48, Jacob and Joseph discuss transferring 2 of Joseph's sons over to Jacob's name and estate to be inheritance recipients of Jacob's lineage and blessing, while the rest of Joseph's sons stay with Joseph's name and estate, along with the rest of their brothers. But like I also said before, the scenario where the slave would prove himself trustworthy enough to the master to receive the blessing of his departing gifts and the permission to take his wife and children back with him to some possible land inheritance he may or may not have, while technically possible, It's a scenario that would be very unlikely to happen, only because such a scenario would mean enough trust is built up between the master and all parties involved that it would make more sense to just stay with the master as a worker, reap those benefits of becoming not just a lifelong slave to the master, but an adopted son himself, and an heir of the master's estate through a relationship of trust that's already been established, instead of starting anew somewhere else. This is exactly what's described in the next verses. It says, "But if the slave plainly says, 'I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free,' then his master shall bring him to God, and he shall bring him to the door or the doorpost, and his master shall bore his ear through with an awl, and he shall serve him for life." I'm convinced that through this formal process, the slave ends up becoming married to the concubine, and the concubine enters into a marriage covenant with the slave, where they can raise children together, because the text says that the slave, quote, plainly says his love for his wife, and this ceremony happened before the doorpost, which traditionally was where the elders gather to act as witnesses of such oaths and ceremonies. But more than that, the slave himself is in the runnings to be more than just a lifelong slave, but to be like a son, in that he could inherit the name and estate of the master he works for. As Proverbs chapter 17, verse 2 says, "A servant who deals wisely will rule over a son who acts shamefully, and will share in the inheritance as one of the brothers." This practice of a master providing a wife to his own slave, and the slave becoming an heir to the master's name estate, is clearly seen even in the narratives of the Bible, because in Chronicles, 1 Chronicles 2, 34 and 35, it records, "Now Sheshan had no sons, only daughters, but Sheshan had an Egyptian slave, whose name was Jarha. So Sheshan gave his daughter in marriage to Jarha, his slave, and she bore him Attai." And then it goes through the lineage of Attai, which was passed from Sheshan through his foreign slave by means of Sheshan providing a wife to his slave Jarha. Notice how Jesus himself refers to the slave who decides to stay working for the master forever. If the slave stays forever, is he not in effect becoming adopted as a son? Jesus says in John chapter 8, "The slave does not continue in the house forever, the son continues forever." Now, I'll cover in a future video more about this aspect of the slave's adoption as a son, and how we are to think about the differences between what a slave is and what a son is in relation to the head and master of the estate. But for now, I hope you see that this interpretation I offer so far is the only one that avoids all the inconsistencies put forth by anyone else, be it from atheists or modern church leaders, and it melds perfectly with all the other verses in the Bible related to this topic. And there are more depths of riches to be found in this law, if you want to ruminate on it more. But let me point out one more thing about the concubine before I go into that. When a person was in slavery, they could not enter into a marriage, because marriage covenants were only arrangements that free men and women could enter into. And this truth is proven by the texts of Paul in Galatians, where Paul distinguishes between the free wife, Sarah, and the slave, concubine, Hagar, as well as the concubinal law found in Leviticus 19, which requires Israel to distinguish between a concubine and a wife, and to treat them differently based on the fact that the concubines were not free like married wives were. So in Exodus, when the master gives the woman to the slave, he is arranging between them a concubinal relationship, not a marriage, since both of them are in slavery. Again, I go more in depth on that in my other series if you want to go into it, but just keep that in mind for this next part. There's a law in Deuteronomy 21, verse 22, that says, "And if a man has committed a crime punishable by death, and he is put to death, and you hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain all night upon the tree, but you shall bury him the same day, for a hanged man is accursed by God." And when Paul read this law, he interpreted it as being a foreshadow of Christ's coming redemption, because in Galatians chapter 3, verse 13, he quotes this law in reference to Christ, saying, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law, having become a curse for us. For it is written, cursed be everyone who hangs on a tree. So we see Paul is teaching that there are hints in the law of God which point to Jesus and his coming redemption in the life of Israel, and that the wise and studied in Israel would have seen these to anticipate the Messiah and his mission. Well, I think I might have found one of those hints in the text when I read this section of Exodus 21, because at the moment when the slave is released to his freedom, he's faced with a decision point to either leave the concubine behind or not. And in the action to plainly state that he loves the woman and wants to stay with her, he's going to have to go through an action from the status, not as a slave anymore, but as a free man. And because he's acting freely at that decision point, he is actually taking this woman on no longer as a concubine, but as a wife in a marriage covenant. When he does this, he gives up his own freedom, subdues himself before the master to becoming a slave again and for the rest of his life, while maintaining the woman in a lifelong commitment in a free marriage. This process reminds me very much of how Philippians and Ephesians describe how God could have stayed in a high position of power, but decided to lower himself by taking on a human form. It's probably best if I just quote the verse. Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 8. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even death on a cross. And then Ephesians 5, verses 25 and 27 says, Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, that he might present the church to himself in splendor. I see these very things happening in the actions of the slave in Exodus 21 who decides to give up equality with other men, giving up his personal freedom, in fact, using his freedom to lower himself into the humble position of a slave in order to take a woman out of concubinal slavery and present her to himself as a free wife in a marriage covenant. And he does this through the ritual of taking an awl through the ear. The slave takes on a woman rescued from slavery to be his bride by himself, being pierced with an awl the same way Christ takes on the church rescued from slavery to sin as his own bride by himself being pierced on the cross. This parallel is so stark to me as I read this passage from Exodus 21 that I can't not think that it was planted here on purpose by God as one of those foreshadowing moments in the law pointing to Christ. The kind of foreshadowing Paul found in the law also. So I would encourage the listener to explore this passage more in unpacking this parallel to better understand the riches it communicates about Jesus' work, and also to keep your eyes open whenever you're studying the law on your own time and see if you can spot for yourself these nuggets of theological richness that God planted throughout his holy law.